For more insight into the U.S. rejoining the global effort against climate change, let's bring in Daniel Kreeger. He is co-founder and executive director of the Association of Climate Change Officers. Daniel, thank you so much for joining our program today. A lot of countries, as you know, are breathing a sigh of relief about the U.S. re-entering this climate deal. From a global perspective, how significant do you think this move is?
Well, first of all, I think there are a lot of people beyond countries. I think businesses and university leaders and subnational governments around the world are breathing a sigh of relief that one of the two most significant economic powerhouses is historically and currently is back in play, and that can't be overstated how important that is. But I also think that the model for the Paris Agreement was designed with the notion of U.S. leadership not being at the forefront when it was signed when it was being developed in 2015, and ultimately nations were putting forward their commitments, because there was a long history, frankly, of the U.S. government not having ratified these UNFCCC agreements that were coming out of the negotiations going back to the Kyoto Protocol. So they moved from a top-down approach to a bottom-up. And that really makes for an interesting position for a U.S. presence here and figuring out, well, what does that mean? And how much does that mean for businesses versus how much does it mean for the role that U.S. plays as a developer and a facilitator across the world, both for the public and private sectors?
And speaking of U.S. moves, President Biden is convening a summit of world leaders in April to ramp up action on this agreement. Are we expecting, I wonder, a presence of business representatives, like you mentioned, and how have they been engaged in this climate change issue, where the previous Trump administration was not at all?
Yeah, you know, it's very interesting when former President Trump announced his intent to leave the Paris Agreement back in 2017. Immediately, there was a very strong response from hundreds of CEOs of publicly traded companies, whether they were multinational companies with a presence in the U.S. or headquartered in the U.S., not to mention subnational leaders, state and local government universities. There was a big cry. And so there have been a very large number of publicly traded companies, Fortune 500 companies, S&P 100 companies, who have been on this and pushing hard for a long time, well before the Trump administration, well before even the Obama administration. And there's been a crescendo. A lot of that was being driven by investor activism. Some of it was companies who had recognized just how significant climate change impacts were going to be on their bottom line and to their customers and their marketplace. But one of the things that interestingly happened was a lot of businesses that are either government contractors or potentially can be harmed by regulatory action were put between a rock and a hard place, and now they're not. So between the increasing forces of investor demands, of pension funds, of activists, environmental activists, of the consumers, of the marketplace, and now a policy landscape that seems to be getting to be aligned in hopefully, and that they're not shackled anymore. And that's a big difference. And so you're really starting to see that groundswell kick in with science-based targets that have been established by an increasing number of companies, companies that are putting a price on carbon in their operations. Increasingly, we're seeing them call for policy. And I think you'll see that continue to develop. The real question is whether or not the industries that are that are at the intersection between the world of yesterday and the world of tomorrow, the fossil fuel industry, for example, are they going to be resistant to it, or are they going to step up and be the engines of transformation that we need in society?
And Daniel, you mentioned those S&P 500 companies. I want to refer to a recent study saying that climate change and energy policy were discussed on earnings calls of 20 out of 28 S&P 500 companies. So clearly this is a big deal for them. You mentioned some of these issues, but can you talk more specifically about some of these focus issues that they are most concerned about with this agreement?
Yeah, well, and they're not just addressing it in the context of this agreement. The reality is publicly traded companies have had requirements to report material risks to investors well beyond the issue of climate change for decades. Those risk reporting requirements overseen by the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC in the US, but also there are more than a dozen countries and jurisdictions around the world that also have similar sorts of risk reporting requirements for publicly traded companies. Well, about 18, 19 years ago, we started seeing questionnaires being sent in by investors or organizations representing large amounts of investors to those companies. It started with the Carbon Disclosure Project, now known as CDP. And on an annual basis, you started to see investors get emboldened. Not only were they sending these questionnaires in, which investor relations and general counsels of big publicly traded companies felt compelled to respond to, you started to see rating systems. You see the ratings agencies, the credit rating agencies jumping in on this as well, and saying that they might at some point start to address the rating based on the maturity of response in this. And so you have all of these things really coming into line over 18 years. Over the last year, you see reports from the Commodities Future Trading Commission, the Government Accountability Office, the Securities and Exchange Commission. You see senators like Elizabeth Warren calling for a review of SEC oversight of those disclosures. And those disclosures don't just address impending international regulation and the impacts of it, but also the physical impacts of climate change, the marketplace changes that result in it, and legal liability considerations. So you're seeing increasingly these companies are under pressure to do so. The smart ones realize that it's not just a compliance issue, but really that this is, if they want to be successful and they want to thrive, that they need to be in front of this. And so you're seeing companies like Moody's and Swiss Re and Unilever and Deloitte and BlackRock, KPMG and UBS, who all participated in the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which set out to create the standard disclosure framework for publicly traded companies, and it's finally taking foot. Even the Commercial Bank of China was part of that group.
Daniel, unfortunately, that's all the time we have. Daniel Kreeger of the Association of Climate Change Officers, thank you so much for your perspective.